Okay, everyone, let's get started. So thank you all for coming today, for joining us virtually for our webinar on writing op-eds and letters to the editor. And so before we even get started, we're interested in kind of your confidence in doing this. So I'm going to launch a poll briefly. Can you just let us know right now, how confident do you feel to write an op-ed or letter to the editor? Maybe some of you have done it. Maybe some of you have never even thought about it. We just kind of want to gauge where y'all are at. So we'll take probably about a minute and then see some results. All right, so I'm going to close this and then let's see what we got. Okay, so this is perfect. So in the bottom kind of half of confidence on writing an op-ed or an LTE, and that's fine because that's what we're here to talk about today. So hopefully you get something out of this. All right, so now to the actual webinar. So I'm Shane. We'll go over proper introductions in a second, but before that, and again, this is a part of a series of webinars, so if you've seen these slides before, I apologize. We'll go through them quickly. But we are part of the American Geophysical Union. If you're not familiar, we're a big Earth and space science society. We have over 20 journals, usually one big in-person fall meeting, not in person this year, but still pretty big, and then a bunch of smaller conferences. Within AGU is Sharing Science, which is what we do. We are the Sharing Science program. Our whole mission is to provide scientists with the skills, tools, resources, and opportunities that they need to communicate their science to anyone, to friends, family, policymakers, journalists, whoever that might be. We do this through a whole number of different ways. We offer workshops, in person and virtual now. We do it through this, webinars. We have an entire series on communicating science. We have a really robust social media accounts, online presence. So we encourage you to check these things out. And we will be following up after this webinar with a whole bunch of resources that will email to you as well. I mentioned this is part of a series, so some of you have already been coming to this webinar series, but this is our Skills for the Complete Scientist. We are, oh goodness, we're in October already, so we're more than halfway through. But if you've missed any, we have them all archived. We'll provide that information in our follow-up. And you can go, if you're interested in virtual presentations or lightning talks or global relationships, you can check out our future ones. So we hope that you would do that. Finally, who is actually talking to you? So I'm Shane, this, I guess, amorphous voice that you're hearing. We'll throw on our webcams all at the end for Q&A. But I'm one of the core Sharing Science employees with my colleague Olivia. I have a herpetology background, came to this world through some science policy experience and ultimately ended up in the Sharing Science program where I get to dabble in a whole bunch of different sciencey things, which I really enjoy. Olivia?
Sure, thanks, Shane. So yes, I'm Olivia Ambrosio, also a biologist by training, although we didn't plan it that way, and had a very circuitous route that is possible, but I would not necessarily recommend, into the SciComm world. Ended up at AGU helping them develop and now expand upon their Sharing Science program along with Shane.
Thanks, Olivia. And so Olivia and I are going to sit back today. We are generalists. We know a bunch about, or I guess I'm not going to say a little about a lot of things, but we're much more general in our SciComm experience. But we are fortunate today to have a couple folks who know a lot about this. So first, we'll start with our colleague, Katie. Katie, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Katie Brundell, the Media Relations Program Manager here at AGU. And AGU's Media Relations team reaches out to the press about AGU published research in our journals, as well as AGU's organizational priorities. And in addition to conducting outreach to the press, our team writes news releases, media advisories, blog posts, and many other forms of communications. And the media relations team actually runs the press operations every year at fall meeting. And we also work on AGU's social media channels, and we produce Third Pod from the Sun, which is AGU's fun science podcast. And now I'll turn it over to Helen so she can introduce herself and the outlet that she works for.
Thanks, Katie, and hi, everyone. So I'm Helen Morgan, an associate editor and producer at Devex, and I manage and edit our op-ed section. So for anyone who's not familiar with Devex, it's a media platform for the development community where we publish coverage in the form of articles, videos, visual stories about news and trends and analysis in the global development and humanitarian sector. So covering climate change or nutrition, food systems, and global health, among many other topics. And from the op-ed side, I work with work with experts in the field, from researchers and academics or humanitarian workers, policymakers, to shape their ideas and publish opinion pieces on devex.com. And we're a global team of journalists and editors in various different countries all over the world.
Great, thanks you two. So before we get into, I'll first hand over to Katie, but I just want to launch one more poll because this is about op-eds and LTEs, and I want to know, have any of you done either an op-ed or a letter to the editor before? So I'll leave this up for maybe 30 seconds. One other thing I want to mention that we will have a formal Q&A section at the end of the webinar, but throughout in your little dashboard on probably the right-hand side of your screen, there is a questions box there. So throughout the webinar, if you have questions, please type them into the box and we will get to as many of those questions as we can. So you can kind of do it in real time and we'll answer them at the end. All right, so it seems like folks are leveling off on the poll. I'm gonna close this, see what we have. All right, so majority of you haven't, and that's not surprising based on your kind of level of comfort. And again, that's completely fine. That's what we're here to talk about today. So at this point, I am going to hand the reins over to Katie.
Great, thanks Shane. And thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to start by talking about some of the basic information that you need to know about op-eds and letters to the editor, or in short, LTEs. And you'll see me use the LTE acronym throughout the presentation. So let's just get started. So with all the research and writing that you're doing, you're probably wondering, why would I even write an op-ed or an LTE? Why is this an important form of science communication? And those are both excellent questions. Both op-eds and LTEs are excellent ways for you to raise awareness about your science, the important role that science plays in our society, and even the necessary functions such as ensuring continued funding for scientific research. And op-eds and LTEs are really just a couple of tools in your toolbox that you can use to get the word out to the public. So these tools are also a way in which you can make yourself visible as an expert in your local community. So for example, if you're a hydrologist and you work in an area that is prone to flooding, writing a public-facing op-ed can let community members and even decision makers know that you can help come up with some evidence-based solutions that would help protect lives and property. And, you know, like the famous quote from Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. Or in this case, if you write it, they may call. And finally, writing an op-ed or an LTE allows you to use your expertise to add something new to the conversation. This could be about a local issue or a science-related issue. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later on. Oops, sorry. So here are some quick facts you should know about letters to the editor. They are written in response to an article, and for the most part, an LTE is submitted to a news outlet that published the article or story that you want to respond to. So for example, if you live in the Chicago area and you see an article in the Chicago Sun-Times that you really wanted to respond to or just add an interesting fact to the conversation, you'd only submit that letter to the Chicago Sun-Times. Letters to the editor tend to be very short, so aim to keep your response really brief, usually around 150 to 200 words. Use additional facts or stats to support what the article was about, or if you see something where a clarification is needed, you can provide that new information in a way that is useful and approachable. You're looking to further the conversation. And make sure that any argument you're making is brief and keep your facts streamlined too. You don't want to submit anything that's too long or overly complicated. An op-ed is short for opposite the editorial page. This is the area of a traditional print newspaper that is literally the page across from where the editorial board publishes. It's where you'll see opinion pieces and features from authors who are not necessarily affiliated with that particular news outlet. Op-eds are opinion pieces, so you should state your point of view early on in the op-ed and then back up your argument with relevant information, stats, and facts. You should also be persuasive because you want readers to understand what you're saying, but also your expertise in saying it. You want to demonstrate why they should trust you and the argument that you're making. Op-eds tend to be much longer than letters to the editor. While it varies by news outlet, op-eds tend to be around 750 to 800 words. Some outlets might actually want slightly longer op-eds. The length can really vary. So it's important that you look at the publication's submission guidelines and requirements so you know how long your op-ed, or even your LTE for that matter, should be. So now that we know some of the basics about how op-eds and LTEs differ, what are some of the best practices that you should use? First, you want to be timely. And you'll want to be timely not in the sense of a scholarly journal, but timely in the way that news outlets and reporters operate. So for example, if you're looking to respond to an article with a letter to the editor, you should submit that within a week of the article being published. In fact, the sooner the better. For an op-ed, you'll want to look ahead at what might be coming up. So for example, we know that there is a pretty defined hurricane season. If you're an atmospheric scientist, you may want to consider writing an op-ed about new or recent hurricane research during peak hurricane season. That is generally when it would be of most interest to both news organizations and the general public. Keep it simple. Use plain language that is easily understandable and accessible to non-scientists. Think to yourself, how would you explain this to a new student who hasn't studied this issue yet? Make sure you leave the more technical language for your research papers. And then I highly recommend that you reach out to and work with the press contacts at your institutions or your public information officers. These professionals can really help with writing for more mainstream outlets, and they will help make sure that your op-ed or your LTE is approachable to the audiences you're trying to reach. They also tend to be familiar with the local papers and news outlets. And finally, this is really important. Do not submit an op-ed to more than one outlet at a time. Only send it to one outlet for consideration. If you get a rejection note, then you're free to submit your op-ed to another publication. If you submitted an op-ed and you didn't hear back from anyone, that's totally fine. Generally speaking, news outlets tend to want a week or so to consider your op-ed. Double check with each outlet's guidelines, but the general rule is that you can submit your op-ed to another outlet after a week if you haven't heard back from their editors. And don't take it personally if you get rejected. I'm sure Helen can speak to this a bit more, but news outlets and publications can receive hundreds of submissions in any given week or even in a day, so just keep trying. So just like Olivia's drawing of a shark over here, LTEs should be streamlined. You'll want to start your letter by briefly stating which article you're responding to and why. The why should explain your point of view and why you think this issue is important. Next, you'll introduce the statistics, the facts or examples that back up your argument and support your point of view. These should be streamlined as well. Use facts that are very brief and clear. You only have a couple hundred words, so don't use up too much valuable real estate listing complicated facts and information. And then finally, you'll conclude your letter by stating your point of view again and making a specific call to action or ask. Make it clear to readers what you're looking to accomplish or what you want them to do with the information that you presented. For example, it could be, should they urge their policymakers to support science funding? What is it you want them to do or act on? Make sure you close your letter with something aspirational and actionable. So what does a successful LTE look like? Well, this is an example of a letter that was published in the New York Times. And I've added the boxes to walk through the different sections of the letter and how they might look written out. So here at the top in the green box is the lead. This is where the author makes it clear which article in the Times they're responding to and clearly states why they are responding to it. So in this case, it's because this issue is urgent. They explain why this is important now, that the world is about to lose the gains it has made in the light against this deadly disease of malaria. Right underneath that is this purple box, and that is where the author adds to the conversation about malaria. These are facts and stats that were not used in the original article, but while the author is taking the conversation further by adding this additional information, they're also providing data and evidence to back up why this issue is important and their argument about the urgency of it. You'll also note that the author just hyperlinks the text to their sources. When you're writing an op-ed, an LTE, or even a blog post, hyperlinks are the best way to cite your sources online. And then finally, in the yellow box over on this side, the author highlights what the ask or call to action is. In this case, the ask was to secure US federal funding for global health initiatives. The author also concludes by reiterating their argument to continue this important work. So Helen's going to talk more about op-eds, but I'm going to give just a very brief overview of what goes into an op-ed. First, you want to introduce the topic of your op-ed and its hook. Briefly explain why the topic is important and perhaps why it's notable at that particular point in time. So we talked earlier about writing an op-ed about research findings on hurricanes during peak hurricane season in the US. That could be a really great hook and can explain why readers would be interested in what you have to say at that particular point in time. The next few paragraphs should focus on your supporting facts and information. This is where you want to back up the argument that you're making and also provide additional food for thought. Using the hurricane op-ed example again, this would be a great place to cite facts and figures from a new study and mention your own research into hurricanes as an atmospheric scientist. This is the section where you move from getting the audience interested to trusting you as an expert on this broader issue. And then the last paragraph should close with a strong statement of your point of view and what your call to action is for the audience. And like a letter to the editor, an op-ed isn't just reiterating facts. You have to have a point of view and state it. earlier, we covered some best practices or do's for op-eds and LTEs. Now let's talk about some of the don'ts. First, don't write something that is too complicated. You want to keep it simple. Make sure your argument isn't overly complicated and that any information or facts that you cite is easily understandable. Think back to the LTE example we just looked at. It only took about 3 sentences or so to use and explain those really powerful statistics. And you always want to streamline and simplify. If it's an LTE, it might be just 2 to 3 sentences, and in an op-ed, you may only have a few paragraphs. Second, don't use too much jargon. Explain things in a way that non-scientists will understand. And remember, an op-ed or an LTE is submitted to a mainstream outlet, not a scholarly journal. And finally, don't use citations in the traditional sense. You can use hyperlinks to cite your sources in an online op-ed or LTE. Using in-text or parenthetical citations would use up a lot of your space, so hyperlinking is a more efficient way to cite your sources, particularly for your readers as well. If they want to see a source, one of your source materials, it's really only a click away for them. And think back to the LTE example we looked at. The author used hyperlinks to cite their sources for the stats that they used. Also, keep in mind that op-eds have an advantage. Since you're writing them, you get to control what you say. While you won't necessarily get to choose your headline, you do get to have input in the conversation and the argument of your op-ed. This is a good way to get your science out in the public more if you're nervous about interviewing with members of the press. Before you get to writing, you need to do some research into what the best outlet is to submit to. Not all publications accept op-eds or LTEs, so that's one thing that you definitely need to look out for. And also, not all news outlets call op-eds by that term. They might say something like opinion or ideas. So look for different names for an op-ed. You also need to know who your audience will be. For example, if you choose to submit an opinion piece to a science-focused publication, you're more likely to reach members of the science-interested public. If you submit something to your local newspaper, you'll reach people in your community, but their interests and their expertise will be much broader. So their experience in science will vary more, and you'll need to use more common everyday language. When you're doing your research, you also want to look at what the outlet's submission guidelines and requirements are and make sure that you follow them. Also, make sure that you adhere to their word count. If an outlet lists a word limit of 800 and you submit a 900-word op-ed, they may not take it. Most outlets list this kind of information on their website. I've included a screenshot here of Wired magazine submission information. And sometimes this information will be in the opinion section of the site, and sometimes it'll be in the contact us section. It really varies, but it's usually searchable and findable. At the end of your op-ed that you're submitting, include your personal information, including your name, title, your university or other affiliation, your contact information, and mailing address. And this won't necessarily be published, but the editors really need to know how to reach you. And also please mention that you're an AGU member. We always like to see that. So when you're looking to submit an opinion piece, consider reaching out to your local newspaper. For science-focused writing, there are many outlets to submit to, and these are just a few that I'm listing here, including The Conversation, Scientific American, Undark, and in fact, AGU leaders have placed op-eds in Scientific American and Undark just this year. The op-ed project is a great resource to find op-ed writing tips and how to pitch an op-ed and even follow up. The site also lists submission information for numerous outlets across the country. So the link is here. and will be provided in the PowerPoint slides after the webinar. Lastly, make sure you work with your press office. In addition to helping edit your piece or support you in submitting it, they can let you know what they might have planned for outreach to a particular outlet so that your submission can be complementary. They are also typically familiar with the local news outlets too, so they can help with any outreach to those newspapers. And now I'm going to turn things over to Helen, who will talk more about op-eds.
Thank you, Katie. And that was really great. It was really good to hear from your perspective. Firstly, I also, a bit like you did, I want to take a step back and look at what is an op-ed and why anyone should write one. I'm having a little bit of technical issue actually changing the slide.
Helen, I can do it for you.
Thank you. So yeah, firstly, to take a step back, what is an op-ed? So generally speaking, an op-ed or an opinion piece is a piece of writing used to reflect the opinions of an author or a group of people. And we write op-eds for many reasons, as Katie mentioned. One reason is to effectively break down and communicate ideas outside of an academic context or following the publication of an academic paper or piece of research. It's also used to spark debate and to discuss opinions and raise awareness around a neglected or potentially misunderstood issue or idea. So before we get into the more in-depth information about what goes into an op-ed and its basic structure, before you write, there are just a few things to consider. I would firstly recommend planning, and I've written this 3 times as it cannot be understated how important this is in my opinion. So you can begin with a clear thesis in mind and make sure that you're writing about what you know. So choose a topic that you have authority in, as well as a persuasive argument. Make sure to develop a clear structure with defined sections, and as part of this, keep in mind that it's a good idea to break down complex ideas, and you could even include subheadings if that helps, and make sure that you make it clear when there is a link between different ideas. Now, here are the components that make up an op-ed and its basic structure. So briefly, that's the lead, the thesis, the argument, the counter-argument, and lastly, the conclusion. And I'll talk a little bit more in the next slide on what this looks like when it comes to writing the op-ed. So in the opening section and the first few paragraphs, as Katie also mentioned, start with a hook to engage the reader. You should frame the issue with context or a data point, for example, or you could introduce it by illustrating it and making it relatable with an example or an anecdote. But this should be brief, and the op-ed should really get to the point early on. The moment a reader starts reading your op-ed, they really need to know what it's about and why it matters to them. You could also include a nut or a nut graph, and this is a short paragraph to explain the context of the story. In the following paragraphs, you should flesh out the problem or issue that you're discussing and look at what some of the potential solutions are. And you could even discuss what the other side of the story or debate or issue is, if there are any flaws in the argument. Although if you do this, it should also be brief. And to sign off, end with a call to action. Leave readers with a strong sense of what needs to be done, and you could even give them some actions that they can take. And I've added a link at the bottom there to some of the good tips from Harvard Kennedy School of Communications program. So at Devex, what we look for in an op-ed Well, the audience at Devex is quite specific. Among them are development practitioners or policymakers, and generally people who are familiar with the context of the development sector. And so as an editor on the other side of the process, I have a few things that I regularly recommend to people submitting op-eds or who are interested in submitting op-eds. Firstly, I would say that ideally it should be a piece that's around 800 to 1,000 words long. As Katie mentioned, it varies from publication to publication. And this helps ensure that it's concise and also that readers are more likely to read through to the end, rather than if it's a 2,000 word piece. There should be a focus on the issue rather than only on an organization's work, and a clear argument that's backed up with facts and data. Additionally, a focus beyond why an issue is important to how actors are or could make an impact and what's needed and how to get there. And integrated within this could be practical advice or recommendations to global development practitioners. And lastly, as I already mentioned, a strong call to action right at the end. Here's one example of an op-ed. It might be slightly hard to see the text. There are some screen grabs here of an op-ed that was published fairly recently. Now, it's not related to the field that I'm sure most of you are working in, but still hopefully a useful example. And I've added some arrows which illustrate where the writer has followed this kind of guidance. So the headline is, as you can see, African Women Are Leading the Fight Against COVID-19 by Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And it opens with a strong hook. So in this instance, the statement that at the time of writing, women-led countries had fewer confirmed COVID deaths. And this is backed up with the name of the report where that was published. And it also goes on to explain why this may be the case. Then it makes sure that the reader understands the context and why it's important, followed by an anecdote, and in this case about how the author is speaking from her own experience of having led her country through the Ebola outbreak. In the following paragraphs, the op-ed goes into many different examples and focuses on several different solutions, which were all led by women, backing up her initial point. And towards the end, it includes a call to action for heads of state across Africa to appoint women to their cabinet. That's just one example, and in the follow-up, I'm happy to also share some more examples as well. So I've added some do's and don'ts when submitting an op-ed. So these are some common mistakes that I see sometimes happen when people are submitting op-eds, and things to look out for. So do be familiar with the audience, know who you're writing for, and think about who reads the platform or medium where the article will be published. You can also consider who reads about the issue you're addressing, and this may help you to make some decisions about the kinds of words that you use, for example, technical terms, or the kinds of stories that you tell throughout the op-ed. Back it up as well, as Katie and I have already said. Every statement should be backed up with evidence, and generally data and statistics are used to reinforce the points being made, and historical facts and figures can be used to help as well. Your submission should include hyperlinks to online sources or titles of sources if they're from print publications, and these will also help fact checkers who are working on the other side, on the editing side. Follow formatting rules, as Katie also mentioned. So each publication has their own guidelines, and it's important to follow these, as well as the word count that's given by the publication where you're submitting the piece. And this will help to reduce the amount of editing that may be needed. And along with that, also be concise with language. I'd recommend that after writing a draft, waiting a few hours or a day or so and revisiting the piece and try to shave off some of the additional words that maybe aren't needed. This also helps to make sure that you're not repeating yourself, and it will also help in the editing process as well. And where possible, Avoid using jargon or technical language that could possibly alienate the reader. So explain concepts to broaden the understanding for readers that might not be experts in the field that you're writing about. And again, as Katie mentioned, do avoid publishing the op-ed in another publication while you're discussing publishing it with someone who's already editing it or considering it. So this does happen occasionally. So if you're sending the op-ed to multiple publications, it is okay to let them know. And also you could even give a date that you would expect a response by before you decide to publish it elsewhere. And this is helpful to the editor and will also make sure that you continue a good relationship with the publication. And so lastly, just to recap some top tips, before you start to write, plan. Keep your argument or thesis in mind. Be as concise as possible. Remember who your reader is. Avoid jargon where possible, and end your op-ed with a call to action.
Thanks so much, Helen. And so I just wanted to kind of end with, this is not a comprehensive list by any means, and we actually have a question about this in the questions box. But there are so many different places, specifically in the science world, where you can pitch op-eds. They all have different processes, like Katie mentioned, and they all have different requirements, so make sure you look into those. But like I said, this is not a comprehensive list. This is mostly in the sciences, but these are some of the more common outlets, in addition to, there was, Katie, an example of Undark, Science Daily might be another one. So we'll try to pull together somewhat of a bigger list in our follow-up emails. And I will note that I also recently came across a list from the what was it? The Citizen Climate Lobby, who has a list of how to submit op-eds to, I think, like 100+ of local news outlets. So we'll provide a link to that as well. So with that, we'll get to questions in a second. But before we do, I wanted to take one more poll. So thank you for bearing with, but it's the same poll. I just kind of want to see where folks are at now that we've gone through this and you've heard such great things from Katie and Helen. So take a minute or so, please, to fill out this last poll, and then we'll do some finer touches and get to some questions. As a reminder, we already have a bunch of questions, thank you much, but if you have one, you can type it into the question box on your little dashboard on the side of your screen. All right, give you all a few more seconds. We seem to be leveling off. All right. Oh, look at that. Well, that's really great. So in the past, I guess, say 35 minutes, we've seen a pretty big shift in confidence. And this is only the beginning. We can only get through so much here. So we have lots of resources and other things that we can share with you in the follow-up. But for the last part, I will hand it to Olivia to talk about what's next.
Thanks, Shane. Yeah, so again, we hope that this is only the beginning of your adventures with us, or perhaps the continuation if you've been following our webinar series all along or otherwise involved with our workshops and so on. But please do consider looking into the rest of the series, and also please keep an eye out in the new year, because we are already planning a whole new series on topics around communication. So this will be a continuing, if not continual, series. And also, you can take the opportunity, now that you feel so much more prepared to write an op-ed or an LTE, to do so during Earth Science Week, which is next week. You can take this opportunity during this Climate Virtual Advocacy Week to talk about the effects of climate change in your community, highlight the community need for climate action. So this is nice. You can do that call to action that Helen was referring to, and submit to local papers, because if you get one published there and you send it to your legislator, they're going to care a lot more about what's going on in that regard. So again, if you don't have a chance to copy this link right now, not to worry, we will send it in the follow-up later, but do consider that as an option as well. And then we are on all the social media, as we have mentioned if you've been in previous webinars, both us personally as individuals and AGU and Sharing Science. So please do follow us, be a part of the conversation. We're always interested in getting more people engaged around these issues. And if you're not part of the Sharing Science community yet, why not, for heaven's sake? It's a very short form that you can fill out, put in a profile, and then you have access to a whole platform where you can find out about opportunities, jobs, ways to engage, talk with others, a whole slew of resources in the social science around science communication, and much more. So again, definitely consider that. Check out our Twitter accounts, check out our AGU Sharing Science webpage that has many, many other resources for you. And with that, we will be happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Olivia. All right, so we're going to start going through some of these again. Wow, lots of great questions. Okay, start with some small ones. So can op-eds and LTEs be authored by more than one person? Do all the authors need to be scientists and PhDs? Can you kind of like mix those two? And I'll, just for easiness, I'll direct this one to Katie.
Great. So the first question about multiple authors. My general rule that I've operated with is for letters to the editor, because they're so short, generally you might want to just have it be from one author. But with op-eds, you can definitely have a couple co-authors. And then the second question was, I believe, about, I'm sorry, Shane.
Do they all
can you
need to
please
be
remind me?
scientists?
No, you do not all need to be scientists. No, absolutely not. Letters to the editor and op-eds can be written and even accepted by news publications by anybody.
Great, thank you. This one for Helen. How long should we give, how long should we give editors for a response? Oh, and by the way, so this is, since we're now just going Q&A, this is us. But yeah, Helen, how long should you give an editor to respond?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it varies from publication to publication. As Katie mentioned earlier, generally, I think a good rule of thumb is around a week. We say at Devex 3 working days. But yeah, I would say the more lead time you give an editor, the better, because yeah, there are a lot of people submitting op-eds out there, and so I think there can sometimes be a lot of submissions to review, and in order to make sure that you have more of a chance to actually have the op-ed placed, try to give more lead time than less. So for example, you know, sometimes I'll get a submission and someone would like to have it published the next day, and unless it's an incredibly, you know, kind of complete op-ed that doesn't really need very much editing from my side, it's going to be really difficult to actually get that turned around so quickly. So yeah, I'd say as much time as possible, but up to a week.
Great, thank you. Helen, another one for you. I think this is from someone who might be an editor or maybe on the editing side, but on feedback for a person submitting an op-ed, is it okay to be blunt in comments, i.e. things like, this is too complicated, it's not clear, etc.?
I'd say it's a good idea to always be as kind of diplomatic as possible, and also in comments try to offer some alternatives and some options or suggestions for what could be done, because if you comment that something isn't clear, that might not really illustrate to the person who's written it exactly why it's not that clear or what could be clearer, because perhaps to them it does seem very clear. So I'd say, yeah, be as diplomatic as possible and also offer solutions and suggestions as well.
Hey, thank you. This one for Katie. I've always heard that you should pitch a story, op-ed, etc., prior to submitting the entire piece. What are your recommendations on how to structure a pitch?
Oh, that's a good question. Lately, I think it's best to send the entire draft so that an editor like Helen can really take a look at your argument and your structure and make sure that it's something that fits within what they would be expecting for an op-ed. For a pitch, I think it's always good to include just a very, very short pitch with your draft because it can kind of highlight how it's timely and also draw attention to the importance of it. Of what you're talking about. So for a pitch, keep it as short as possible. That's the key thing. You don't want to have a really long pitch that's going to be the same length as your op-ed basically. So I would say keep it to a paragraph, maybe two at the most, and really just highlight your key arguments and why you think it's important and timely at that point in time.
Yeah, and I will just say, so I've written op-eds before, a handful, not a ton, but it really depends on the outlet on what they're looking for from a pitch to a whole thing or whatever in between. So Katie touched on this, Helen talked about it for Devex, but make sure that you know, read very specifically what the outlet is looking for. Like it's no different than a manuscript. Every sort of journal looks for different things. Every sort of outlet looks for different things. So just keep that in mind. Just some clarifying questions. So I forgot to mention this, but yes, in your dashboard, you have a little tab called handouts, and there are a handful of PDFs in there, including one on writing op-eds and LTEs. All of this, if you don't pull them from the dashboard itself, we will be providing a link in the follow-up email to where all of these guides are, but also, geez, Olivia, I don't know how many we have now, but like at least a dozen more guides, or at least a dozen guides on various science communication things. So be on the lookout. And like I said, probably late next week.
Shane, can I mention
ahead.
one if you don't mind? I see a question that how do you balance being compelling in the op-ed or LTE and exaggerating your expertise or over-promising the potential of your science? And Helen, maybe if you want to go first, and Katie, if you want to jump in.
Wow, that's a really good question. Perhaps this is where the also looking at the counter argument or the potential flaws that there might be, and addressing those and talking about maybe, yeah, that counter argument that I think was in one of the diagrams that was in the PowerPoint. I think that's important. I think it's also important to I don't know how you balance that, but remaining quite transparent about the kind of limits of the argument that you're trying to persuade the reader of, and being honest about it, but while also putting your point of view across. Katie, this might be more in your remit, given the, the topic.
No, I mean, I completely agree with everything that you just said. I think that's where citing your sources really comes into play, because anything that you're arguing, any facts or stats or evidence that you are using to support your argument, you need to be able to back up. So like Helen just said, if there's any sort of limitations to your argument or the science that you're presenting, that's kind of a quick way to think about it, is making sure that you're able to back everything up.
Great. So there's a couple questions that kind of go together. One is, so what level of expertise is best to write an op-ed? And in this respect, it's, do I need to be a level of expertise quantified by academic experience? Like, do I need to be a master's or a PhD or a professor level to write an op-ed? And then something that I personally was wondering about, having been a former academic. Well, let's go with this one first. I don't want to add too many things. So yeah, is there a specific level of expertise? Like, does someone with a PhD, is that looked on more favorably when writing something than someone who maybe doesn't have those letters after their name? And we can go to, let Katie, you can start.
Okay, I was just going to say that no, there's no benchmark of somewhere in academia that you need to be to submit an op-ed or LT. A good thing to think about is both tools are opinions, and everyone has an opinion, and everyone has a worldview and a perspective and knows things that can back up the argument that they're making. So for scientists, if you have a background in science and or academia, that's a way that you can back up an argument that you're making. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who submits an op-ed or an LTE needs to be within that same realm. It's open to everyone. Helen, do you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And also, I think it probably or possibly depends on the publication. But for example, at Devex, one thing that we're looking for is to really broaden who we're hearing from, and making sure that we're not only hearing from people who already have a huge wealth of experience in a certain field, so perhaps people who are recent graduates, or who are just entering into their careers. So I don't think, like you said, Katie, I think it's, everyone has an opinion and is entitled to also share their opinion, just with some of that guidance that we've talked about earlier. So making sure that everything is backed up and that you have a clear and compelling argument. But I think hearing from a more diverse range of people is, I think that's a really good thing.
Great. So the other question I wanted to ask, and there's some other things about this in the questions as well, but Katie, you talked about consulting with your PIO, your public information, or your press office, or something like that. Should folks at like universities, or especially maybe government institutions, be concerned about writing from their personal perspective versus writing from an institutional, or probably more in the government perspective? Like, do you have any, I guess for either of you, do you have any tips on how to balance that? Like, what are you able and I guess authorized to do versus coming from like your institution?
I can jump in from my side. I think it probably really depends on where you're writing from, and I would say to always double check with the institution that you're working in, whether there'll be any issue at all. I've worked with people on op-eds where they've said at the end, in my bio, I'd like to make sure that it says what my expertise are, rather than my title and the organization that I'm working for, because I want to make absolutely sure that this is my perspective rather than me as a representative of this organization. So I'd say it's always worth double checking just in case.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that completely, because I was going to say something very similar, is that your press office or your public information officers, they can help navigate those kind of questions that you have, and they can really help narrow in on that balance that you're looking for, and keeping it appropriate depending on where you're coming from.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Question about expertise. So how close does your expertise, so say you're writing about an academic issue, like a scientific issue, how close does your academic background need to be in the op-ed? For example, if I'm getting a PhD in atmospheric chemistry, but you don't study hurricanes, is it inappropriate to pitch something about that? Like how much are, I guess, editors or the audience tracking your credentials versus what you're writing about?
If you're studying atmospheric chemistry and you want to write about hurricanes, do it. People people are going to see you definitely as an expert on that, and they're going to trust what you have to say about hurricanes. So I wouldn't let sort of a really specific area of interest or research hold you back from anything. Definitely see where your science fits in with a broader issue, because you're definitely going to be seen as an expert on it.
Yeah, I'd second that as well. I think while editors do obviously, like take a look at the person or the profile of the person who's submitting an op-ed, I think it's more the facts and the actual components within the op-ed itself that will be really thoroughly tracked and checked to make sure that those are all correct, rather than saying that this person isn't really hasn't had enough experience or expertise to talk about it.
Great, thank you. So we probably have time for just one more question. We'll go through the rest of them and try to provide answers in our follow-up. So if we didn't get to your question, we'll do our best to get to it in some capacity in the follow-up. But this last one is kind of specific, but can you write your op-ed on Medium? Some folks out there might be familiar with Medium, and then also publish it elsewhere, because I know that Medium is kind of like a self-publishing blog type website. The reason they ask is maybe Medium is the place to keep all of the information in one place versus having to track down separate outlets. So I don't know if there's a special exemption there because Medium's a little bit different than other traditional publishing sources.
Helen might be able to dig into this a little bit more, but I would say generally when you're pitching an op-ed, you're pitching it as exclusive content to that particular news outlet. So if you have something that's already published online that you're using in the op-ed that you're pitching, the editors may not really like that or take it. Helen, do you want to weigh in from your perspective as an editor?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. Again, it might vary from publication to publication, but I would say err on the side of caution and make sure that it's exclusive. We don't actually accept anything that's published anywhere else. So I'd say try to keep it exclusive as long as possible, and also check with the editor that you're submitting a piece to for how long it's got to be exclusive for, because there are republication guidance or rules for each publication as well.
Yeah, it might be in some ways kind of similar to embargoes that folks might be familiar with for journals and press releases and things. Okay, so we're a minute over. So again, we'll try to get to the rest of your questions in a follow-up, but I want to thank Helen and Katie today for providing their expertise with us. It was so appreciated. Thank you very much, especially for Helen. She is not in our time zone. We are on the East Coast in the US. So thanks for staying up and helping out with us. And thank you all of you for coming. You'll get a follow-up email with a recording and a bunch of information. And if you ever need anything else, please feel free to contact us. And Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye all.